The morning mist clung to the abandoned highway like a shroud, and through it, Kestrel Voss could see them, dozens of shambling figures moving with the relentless hunger that had consumed the world. She pressed her back against the concrete barrier, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the undead horde below. 23. Too many to fight, too spread out to avoid. "We can't stay here," whispered Thorn Blackwood from beside her, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from rebar and duct tape. The former construction foreman had survived longer than most, but even his steady nerves were fraying after 3 months of running. Behind them, huddled in the shadow of an overturned semi-trailer, the rest of their group waited in terrified silence. Zara Nightingale clutched her younger brother's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. At 19, she'd become the group's unofficial medic, learning field surgery from YouTube videos before the internet died. Her brother, Ember, only 12 years old, had stopped speaking 3 weeks ago when they'd lost their parents to a swarm outside Nashville. Orion Steele crouched nearby, methodically checking his ammunition for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The former Marine's discipline was both their greatest asset and sometimes their burden. He planned for every contingency except the one where they all simply gave up hope. His scarred face, marked by shrapnel from the early days when the military still fought back, remained impassive as he counted bullets like prayer beads. The outbreak had started in the cities, as these things always did in the movies Kestrel used to watch. But reality was messier, crueler. There had been no dramatic music when Atlanta fell, no heroic last stands broadcast on television. Just silence where millions of voices used to be, broken only by the endless, hungry moaning of what they'd become. Kestrel had been a philosophy professor at Emory University when it began. She'd spent her career pondering questions of human nature and moral courage, never imagining she'd have to live those theories. Now, watching Ember's hollow eyes stare at nothing, she wondered if courage was just another luxury the world could no longer afford. There, Thorn pointed to a gap in the horde's formation. "If we move now, we can make it to that strip mall. Looks like there might be a pharmacy." Medicine was always their priority. Zara had been rationing antibiotics like gold, and Ember's persistent cough was getting worse. In the old world, it would have been nothing, a simple chest infection cleared up with a prescription and rest. Now it could be a death sentence. Orion studied the terrain with tactical precision. 2 minutes to cross open ground. "We'll be exposed, but if we're quiet." He trailed off as one of the creatures below suddenly jerked its head up, dead eyes scanning the overpass where they hid. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the zombies' lifeless gaze seemed to fix directly on their position. They all held their breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself was waiting to see who would blink first. The creature's jaw hung slack, revealing broken teeth stained with old blood. Its clothes, a business suit that had once been expensive, hung in tatters from its decomposing frame. This thing had been someone once. A father, maybe, or a beloved son. Now it was just hunger wearing human skin. The zombie's attention drifted away, drawn by some distant sound only it could hear. The group exhaled collectively, but the moment had shattered their fragile composure. This was their existence now, moments of terror punctuated by brief respites, always wondering when their luck would finally run out. "We need to reach the settlement rumors," Kestrel whispered, voicing what they'd all been thinking. "The one near the mountains. They say it's fortified, safe." "Rumors," Orion muttered, but his tone held more hope than skepticism. Even he needed something to believe in. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the protective mist, the zombies below began to stir with renewed activity. Soon they'd be on the move again, following whatever inexplicable instinct drove them forward. The group had to move first. Kestrel looked at each face around her, these strangers who'd become family through shared terror and desperate trust. They'd lost so much already. But here, balanced on the knife's edge between life and death, she realized something her academic career had never taught her: courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite being absolutely terrified. The real question was whether they had enough courage left to survive what was coming. The pharmacy's broken glass doors crunched under their feet like fallen stars, each step a small betrayal of their presence. Zara moved through the ransacked aisles with practiced efficiency, her backpack already heavy with salvaged antibiotics and pain relievers. Most of the shelves had been stripped bare in the early days, but she'd learned to check the less obvious places, behind fallen displays, in the employee break rooms, anywhere desperate people might have missed. Ember sat by the entrance, his small frame racked by another coughing fit that seemed to echo through the empty building like a dinner bell for the dead. Each hack made Zara's chest tighten with fear and frustration. She'd found some antibiotics, but not the right kind, not enough, and definitely not the inhaler he desperately needed for his worsening asthma. Got movement, Orion's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie from his position on the roof. 3 blocks out, moving our direction. We've got maybe 10 minutes. Thorne was busy reinforcing their escape route, stacking shopping carts to block potential entry points. His hands moved with the same methodical precision he'd once used building houses, but now he was constructing barriers against the end of the world. There's a service tunnel in the back, he called softly. Connects to the neighboring stores. We can move through there if things go bad. Kestrel knelt beside Ember, brushing sweat-dampened hair from his fevered forehead. The boy's breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle that reminded her of her grandfather's final days in hospice care. But this wasn't a peaceful hospital room with morphine drips and gentle nurses. This was a race against time in a world that had forgotten mercy. "Hey there, brave one," she whispered, using the nickname she'd given him after he'd distracted a zombie to save another child in their group, before they'd lost her too. "Zara's going to find you something to help with that cough." Ember's eyes found hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the child he'd been before the world ended. He tried to smile, but another coughing fit seized him, this one bringing up flecks of blood that made Zara freeze in the medical supply aisle. "Shit," she breathed, abandoning her careful search to rush to her brother's side. Blood meant lung damage, possible pneumonia, complications they couldn't handle with their limited supplies. In the old world, this would mean immediate hospitalization, X-rays, for antibiotics, respiratory therapy. Now it might mean watching her little brother slowly drown in his own fluids while she stood helpless. "What do you need?" Kestrel asked, recognizing the barely controlled panic in Zara's voice. "Everything," Zara replied, her hands shaking as she checked Ember's pulse. "Hospital-grade antibiotics, bronchodilators, maybe a ventilator if his lungs are filling with fluid. All the things that don't exist anymore." Through the broken windows, they could hear the distant groaning that had become the soundtrack of their lives. The undead were getting closer, drawn by some unknowable stimulus, perhaps Ember's coughing, perhaps just the random migration patterns that drove them across the wasteland like deadly tumbleweeds. 5 minutes, Orion's voice was tighter now. "And there's more coming from the east. Looks like a full horde, maybe 50, 60 strong." Thorne's face went pale. They'd faced groups of a dozen or so before, but anything over 20 was considered a death sentence. 50 was a nightmare made manifest. How the hell did we miss a group that size? "They move at night now," Kestrel said, remembering something she'd read in the last scientific journal published before the communication networks failed. Some researcher theorized they were adapting, becoming more active in darkness. We might have walked into their daytime gathering spot. The implications hit them all at once. If the undead were evolving, becoming smarter or at least more coordinated, then every assumption they'd made about survival was potentially wrong. The rules of the game were changing, and they didn't even know what the new rules were. Zara finished stuffing whatever medications she could find into her pack, her movements desperate now. "I need more time. There might be samples in the pharmacy office, prescription drugs that." "We don't have more time," Orion's voice cut through the radio static. "They're not just wandering anymore. They're moving with purpose, like they're following a scent trail. We need to move now." Ember tried to stand but swayed dangerously, his face gray with exhaustion and fever. Thorn moved to support him, the big man's rough hands gentle as he helped the boy to his feet. "Come on, kiddo. We're going on another adventure." But as they prepared to flee through Thorn's service tunnel, Kestrel noticed something that made her blood freeze. Ember's cough had stopped, not because he was better, but because he didn't have the strength to cough anymore. His breathing was so shallow it was barely visible, and his lips were taking on a blue tinge that spoke of oxygen deprivation. "He can't travel like this," Zara said, voicing what they all could see. "Moving him could kill him." "Staying here definitely will," Orion replied, but his usual military certainty was cracking. For all his tactical knowledge, he couldn't strategize their way out of a child's failing lungs. Outside, the groaning grew louder, punctuated now by the sound of shuffling feet and the occasional crash as the undead knocked over debris in their relentless approach. The horde was close enough that they could smell the sweet sick stench of decomposition, a odor that had become as familiar as breathing. Kestrel looked around at their desperate faces and made a decision that went against every survival instinct she developed. Sometimes courage meant running toward danger instead of away from it. Sometimes it meant risking everything for one small boy's labored breath. "There's a hospital 2 miles from here," she said quietly. "If we can get there, really get there with enough time to search properly." "That's insane," Orion started, but Thorn was already nodding. "Insane situations call for insane solutions," the older man said. "Besides, what's the alternative? Watch him die slowly while we hide in whatever hole we find next." The groaning outside grew closer, and they could see shadows moving past the broken windows. Time was up. They had to choose, flee and hope Ember survived the journey, or fight their way to a chance at real medicine, knowing they might all die trying. As Ember struggled for another breath, the choice became clear. In a world gone mad, sometimes the only rational response was a kind of loving madness. Part 3, The Hospital of Broken Dreams. The St. Mary's Medical Center loomed before them like a monument to humanity's lost battle against death itself. Its windows were dark, some broken, others painted with streaks of what might have been blood or rust. In this new world, the distinction had become meaningless. The emergency room entrance gaped open like a wound, its automatic doors frozen apart as if the building itself had died with its final patients. Kestrel adjusted her grip on Ember's thin shoulders as Thorn carried the boy's legs. Every few steps, they had to pause as another coughing fit seized him, each one weaker than the last. His fever had spiked during their desperate run through the city's bones, and now his skin burned against her palms like he was being consumed from within. "Movement on the 3rd floor," Orion whispered, his rifle trained on the hospital's upper windows. "Could be survivors, could be infected. No way to tell from here." Zara clutched her medical bag like a talisman, her eyes scanning the hospital's facade with the desperate hope of someone who'd learned to find miracles in abandoned places. "The pharmacy will be in the basement level, but we'll need power to access the secure storage. The really good stuff, morphine, emergency antibiotics, surgical supplies, it'll all be locked up tight." They'd lost the zombie horde 3 blocks back using Thorn's knowledge of the city's underground maintenance tunnels, but they all knew it was temporary. The undead had a way of finding them, drawn by sounds they couldn't hear or scents they couldn't smell. It was as if the living carried some signal that called to the dead across impossible distances. The hospital's lobby was a graveyard of abandoned hope. Wheelchairs sat empty in precise rows, as if their occupants had simply evaporated. The information desk still held pamphlets for services that would never be provided again: managing your diabetes, coping with loss, bringing baby home safely. Each cheerful brochure was a small knife twist in the reality of what they'd all lost. Ember's breathing hitched, and a fine spray of blood misted from his lips. Zara immediately began checking his pulse, her fingers trembling as she tried to find the proper rhythm in his weakening heartbeat. "His oxygen saturation is dropping. We need to get him on supplemental oxygen, maybe even mechanical ventilation if his lungs are filling with fluid." "The ICU will have what we need," Kestrel said, remembering her own father's final stay in a place much like this one. Ventilators, oxygen concentrators, everything. But we'll need to get the emergency power running. Thorne was already studying the directory, his construction experience making him the closest thing they had to an engineer. Generators will be in the sub-basement. But hospitals usually have automatic lockdown protocols during emergencies. The whole building might be sealed. A sound echoed through the empty corridors, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. They all froze, weapons ready, but the steps had an odd rhythm that didn't match the shambling gait of the undead. These were purposeful, careful, almost cautious. "Hello?" a voice called out, female and rough with exhaustion. "If you're alive, please, we need help." Orion kept his rifle ready but signaled for calm. In their months of survival, they'd learned that living humans could be just as dangerous as the dead ones, sometimes more so. Desperation had a way of erasing the lines between civilization and savagery. A figure emerged from the shadows of the main corridor, a woman in scrubs so stained with blood and grime they might have once been any color. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what looked like 4 tubing, and her eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much death to process. "I'm Dr. Sage Blackthorne," she said, her voice cracking with relief at seeing other survivors. "I've been trying to keep the emergency systems running, but the generators are failing, and I've got patients who need—" She stopped, seeing Ember in their arms, her medical training overriding caution. "Respiratory distress, fever, looks like pneumonia." "How long has he been symptomatic?" 3 weeks, getting worse," Zara answered, relief flooding her voice at finally meeting someone with real medical training. "I'm a nursing student, was a nursing student. I've been doing what I can, but—" Dr. Blackthorne was already moving, gesturing for them to follow. "ICU, 2nd floor. I've got 2 other patients up there, one's a 7-year-old girl who was bitten but hasn't turned, and an elderly man with diabetes who's been helping me maintain the equipment. We've been running on emergency power, but it won't last much longer." As they climbed the stairs, Ember's breathing became so labored that they had to stop every few steps. His lips were decidedly blue now, and his eyes were starting to unfocus in a way that made Kestrel's stomach clench with terror. She'd seen that look before, in her grandfather's final hours, the slow retreat from life that no amount of love could stop. The ICU was an island of artificial life in the dead hospital. Machines hummed and beeped, monitors displayed vital signs, and the familiar smell of antiseptic provided a bizarre comfort. Dr. Blackthorne moved with practiced efficiency, preparing a ventilator while explaining their situation. "The bite victim is stable for now, been 5 days with no signs of infection, so either she's immune or the virus has a longer incubation period than we thought. The diabetic gentleman, Marcus, has been invaluable, but his blood sugar is becoming harder to control without proper insulin refrigeration." She paused in her preparations, looking directly at their small group. "I need to be honest with you. The emergency power will fail within 24 hours. When it does, everyone on life support dies. I've been trying to fix the main generators, but I'm a doctor, not an engineer." Thorne stepped forward, understanding the implication. "I can fix them. Probably. But I'll need parts, tools, time to diagnose what's wrong. And protection," Orion added grimly. "Because once those machines stop running, the silence is going to carry for miles. Every zombie in the city will know exactly where we are." Dr. Blackthorne carefully inserted an endotracheal tube into Ember's throat, her hands steady despite the circumstances. "Then we'd better work fast. Because this boy doesn't have 24 hours. As the ventilator began breathing for Ember, the rhythmic whoosh of artificial respiration joining the chorus of medical machinery, Kestrel felt a strange moment of peace. For the first time in months, they had real shelter, real medical care, and real hope. But she also knew that hope was the most dangerous emotion in this new world. It made you careless, made you believe in futures that might not exist. And outside the hospital's walls, the dead were gathering, drawn by the sound of life being sustained against all odds. In the ICU's artificial twilight, surrounded by the electronic hymns of modern medicine, they prepared to make their stand. Not just for Ember's life, but for the idea that healing was still possible in a world dedicated to dying. The machines breathed and beeped their electronic prayers, but Kestrel wondered if anyone was listening anymore. Part 4, The Weight of Impossible Choices. The hospital's basement stretched before them like the bowels of a mechanical beast, pipes and cables snaking through shadows that their flashlights couldn't fully penetrate. Thorne moved methodically through the maze of equipment, his hands reading the machinery with the same confidence he'd once used to frame houses and pour foundations. But this was different. One mistake here, and the people upstairs would die in the growing darkness. Main transformers fried, he announced, his voice echoing off concrete walls that seemed to absorb hope. Lightning strike, looks like, probably months ago. The emergency generators have been running on backup fuel, but the pumps that should be cycling fresh diesel are seized. We're looking at maybe 6 hours of power left, not 24. Above them, through the steel and concrete, they could hear the muffled sounds of Dr. Blackthorne working to stabilize her patients. Ember's condition had improved slightly with the ventilator, but his fever remained dangerously high, and the blood in his sputum suggested complications that required sustained medical intervention. Orion stood guard at the basement entrance, his rifle trained on the emergency stairwell. Through his earpiece, they could hear the distant groaning that had become the soundtrack of their existence. The dead were gathering outside the hospital in numbers that defied their worst expectations. How many? Kestrel asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Hundreds, Orion replied grimly. Maybe more. It's like every zombie in the city heard dinner bell ring. They're not just wandering anymore, they're surrounding the building, systematically covering every exit. Zara was cataloging medical supplies with Dr. Blackthorne's patient list, trying to stretch their resources across multiple critical cases. The 7-year-old bite victim, Luna, had developed a fever overnight, and while she showed no signs of the viral transformation, her wound was showing signs of severe infection. Without proper antibiotics, she could die from sepsis long before anyone figured out if she was immune to the zombie plague. We need parts, Thorne said, wiping grease from his hands. Specific parts for this model of generator. Fuel pump assembly, pressure regulators, probably a new alternator. The kind of stuff you can only get from an industrial supply warehouse or another hospital. There's a medical center about 8 miles north, Dr. Blackthorne's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. Mercy General. They had a similar emergency power setup. But getting there. She trailed off, the impossibility of the situation hanging in the air like surgical smoke. Kestrel studied the schematic Thorne had sketched out, her philosophy background surprisingly useful for understanding complex systems. Every component was connected to every other component, and the failure of any single part meant the death of the whole. It was a perfect metaphor for their situation. They were all connected now, and if one of them fell, they all fell. What if we don't fix it? She asked quietly. What if we focus on getting everyone out instead? The question hung in the recycled air like a challenge to everything they'd been fighting for. Move Ember while he was on life support, and he'd almost certainly die. Move Luna while she was fighting infection, and she might not survive the journey. Move Marcus, the elderly diabetic who'd been helping Dr. Blackthorne, and his unstable blood sugar could kill him within hours. Some of them won't make it, Dr. Blackthorne admitted over the radio. And moving critical patients without proper equipment, it's essentially a death sentence. Orion's voice cut through their debate with cold tactical assessment. We've got bigger problems. The zombies aren't just surrounding us, they're organizing. I can see them positioning themselves at every exit, almost like they're coordinating an assault. The implications chilled them more than the basement's concrete embrace. If the undead were developing tactical thinking, then every assumption about survival was wrong. They weren't just fighting mindless hunger anymore, they were fighting an enemy that might be learning, adapting, evolving. There's something else, Dr. Blackthorn's voice was tight with a fear that went beyond their immediate danger. Luna, the bite victim, her blood work is unusual. Her white cell count is through the roof, but not in a way that suggests infection. It's like her immune system is fighting something we can't identify. What does that mean? Zara asked, though her medical training was already providing unwelcome possibilities. It could mean she's developing immunity. Or it could mean the virus is mutating inside her, creating something new. Without proper lab facilities, I can't tell which. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on them like the hospital's concrete ceiling. Stay and risk being overrun by an increasingly organized undead army. Leave and watch helpless patients die from lack of medical support. Try to repair the generators and risk exposing themselves to zombie attack while working in the vulnerable basement. Thorne made the decision for them with characteristic directness. I'm going after those parts. Mercy General, right? 8 miles through zombie-infested city to maybe find equipment that might work to save people who might not survive anyway. That's suicide, Orion stated flatly. Maybe, Thorne agreed. But sitting here watching kids die because we're too scared to try something dangerous? That's definitely murder. Kestrel found herself thinking about her old philosophy classes, the endless debates about moral courage and ethical responsibility. In the abstract, these questions had seemed manageable, intellectual exercises with clear parameters. But here, in the basement of a dying hospital while machines breathed for children upstairs, philosophy became visceral and immediate. I'll go with you, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Like hell, Orion started, but she cut him off. You need to stay here, protect the hospital. Zara needs to help Dr. Blackthorn with the patients. But Thorne needs backup, and I'm the most expendable person here. No one's expendable, Zara said fiercely, but her eyes were already calculating the brutal math of survival. They all were. Thorne was packing tools and weapons with the methodical care of someone who'd accepted that he might not return. If we're not back in 12 hours, assume we're dead and make whatever choices you need to make. Through the walls, they could hear the growing chorus of undead voices, no longer the random moaning they'd grown accustomed to, but something that almost sounded like communication. The zombies were talking to each other, or at least trying to, and that possibility was more terrifying than anything they'd faced yet. As Kestrel checked her weapons and prepared for what might be her final journey, she thought about Ember struggling for breath 2 floors above them. In her philosophy classes, she'd taught that courage was acting in accordance with virtue despite personal cost. But she'd never explained how to choose which virtue to follow when they all demanded different sacrifices. The machines upstairs continued their electronic prayers, breathing for those who couldn't breathe for themselves, buying time they might not have. And in the basement, 2 people prepared to venture into hell for the chance to keep those prayers going just a little longer. Outside, the dead were learning to think again. Inside, the living were learning that sometimes the most courageous choice was also the most terrifying one. Part 5, Into the Mouth of Hell. The service tunnel stretched beneath the city like a concrete artery, carrying them through darkness that felt thick enough to drown in. Kestrel's flashlight beam danced across graffiti tags from the world before, messages of love and rebellion and teenage angst that now seemed like hieroglyphs from a lost civilization. Her backpack weighed heavy with tools and weapons, but it was the weight of hope that made each step feel like lifting mountains. Beside her, Thorne moved with the steady determination of someone who'd built things his entire life and refused to accept that everything was irreparably broken. His breathing was controlled, economical, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands never strayed far from his weapons. They both knew this was likely a suicide mission, but they'd gone anyway because sometimes the choice between certain death and possible death wasn't really a choice at all. 2 miles down, 6 to go, Thorne whispered, checking the maintenance map they'd found in the hospital's engineering office. The tunnel system connected most of the major buildings in the downtown core, a network of passages that had been their salvation and might now be their tomb. Behind them, through their radio, they could hear the ongoing crisis at the hospital. Dr. Blackthorn's voice was strained as she reported Luna's deteriorating condition. The child's fever had spiked to dangerous levels, and something was happening to her blood that they didn't understand. Ember remained stable on the ventilator, but stable was relative when you were breathing through a machine powered by failing generators. "We've got company," Orion's voice crackled through the static. "The zombies are trying to break through the emergency room barricades. They're using tools, Kestrel. Actual tools. I watched one of them pick up a crowbar and start prying at the doors. The implications hit them like ice water. Tool use meant problem-solving capabilities, which meant the undead were regaining higher brain functions. The plague wasn't just creating mindless killing machines anymore, it was creating something that might be worse. How long can you hold them?" Thorne asked, though they all knew the answer was relative to how many zombies kept arriving. "As long as we have ammunition," Orion replied grimly. "But if they're smart enough to use tools, they're smart enough to find other ways in. We've got maybe 6 hours before they breach the building." Kestrel paused to catch her breath, her lungs burning from the underground air that tasted of rust and decay. 6 hours to reach Mercy General, find the parts they needed, and return to the hospital. It was impossible, but impossible had become their daily reality. The tunnel branched ahead, and Thorne consulted the map by flashlight. "Left takes us closer to Mercy General, but it runs under the old shopping district. Right is longer but avoids the areas where we know there are large zombie populations." "How much longer?" "Maybe 2 extra miles." They didn't have 2 extra miles worth of time, but they also couldn't risk running into an underground zombie nest. Kestrel made the decision with a coin flip, literally pulling a quarter from her pocket and letting chance decide their fate. It came up heads, the Lincoln Memorial side up, which they'd arbitrarily assigned to the shorter, more dangerous route. "Left it is," she said, pocketing the coin that might have just sentenced them to death. The tunnel began to slope upward, and they could hear sounds filtering down from the world above, the groaning of zombies, but also something else. Voices. Human voices raised in what sounded like argument or panic. They emerged from a maintenance hatch behind what had once been a Starbucks, the familiar green and white logo now faded and bullet-scarred. Through the broken windows, they could see the source of the voices, a group of survivors barricaded in a sporting goods store across the street, surrounded by zombies that were indeed using tools. The undead had found shopping carts, construction equipment, even a small forklift, and were methodically dismantling the survivors' defenses. "We have to help them," Kestrel said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they couldn't. Every minute they delayed was another minute closer to the hospital's power failing, another minute closer to Ember's death. Thorne was thinking the same thing, his face a mask of anguish as he watched the desperate battle across the street. "There's nothing we can do. If we stop to fight, everyone at the hospital dies. If we don't stop, these people die." It was the brutal mathematics of survival in its purest form: save the lives you might be able to save, or risk everyone for the lives you definitely couldn't save. The philosophy professors at the university would have called it a classic trolley problem, but academic ethics felt obscene when real people were dying on both sides of the equation. One of the survivors in the sporting goods store, a young woman with blonde hair, caught sight of them through the broken Starbucks window. Her eyes met Kestrel's across the zombie-filled street, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them. The woman knew they were there, knew they could potentially help, and understood when Kestrel slowly shook her head. The woman nodded once, a gesture of absolution that cut deeper than any accusation could have. Then she turned back to her own impossible fight, firing through the store's windows at zombies that were learning to use cover and tactics. Kestrel and Thorne moved through the Starbucks and out the back, each step taking them further from people they might have saved toward people they might still save. Behind them, the gunfire continued for another 10 minutes before gradually falling silent. They both pretended not to notice when it stopped. "Mercy General should be 2 blocks ahead," Thorne said, his voice carefully neutral. They'd both learned not to dwell on the choices that survival demanded, but some cuts went too deep to ignore. The hospital loomed before them like a concrete fortress, its windows dark except for a few emergency lights that suggested some level of power remained. But between them and their destination, the street was full of zombies, not the random wanderers they'd grown accustomed to, but organized groups that moved with disturbing coordination. "They're herding," Kestrel observed, watching the undead move in formation patterns that reminded her of hunting pack behavior. "Like wolves or lions. They're working together. Which means they'll be harder to avoid, but also more predictable," Thorne replied, studying the zombie movements with tactical attention. "If we can figure out their pattern." That's when they heard the explosion from behind them, and through their radio, Orion's voice cut through the static with desperate urgency. "Hospital's been breached. They're inside the building. The generators just took shrapnel damage. We've got maybe 2 hours of power left, if that." Kestrel looked at the zombie-filled street ahead, then at Thorne's determined face, and realized that their impossible mission had just become absolutely impossible. But sometimes the most impossible thing was the only thing worth doing. They checked their weapons one last time and prepared to run into the mouth of hell, because somewhere behind them, a little boy was breathing through a machine that was slowly dying, and somewhere ahead of them was the only chance to keep it alive. Part 6, The Art of Dying Well. Mercy General's emergency room doors hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, and the silence that poured from within was somehow more terrifying than any sound could have been. Kestrel and Thorne crouched behind an overturned ambulance, watching zombies patrol the hospital's perimeter with the methodical precision of guards making rounds. These weren't the shambling hordes they'd learned to avoid, these were organized, purposeful, and displaying tactical awareness that challenged everything they thought they knew about the undead. "They're posted at every entrance," Thorne whispered, his construction worker's eye automatically cataloging structural weaknesses and access points. "But there's a pattern to their movement. 60-second intervals, rotating coverage. If we time it right." Through their radio, Dr. Blackthorn's voice provided a grim countdown to catastrophe. "Generator efficiency is dropping rapidly. I'm getting maybe 90 minutes of power at current consumption rates. Luna's fever has spiked to 104, and I'm seeing neurological symptoms that I can't explain. Her EEG readings are unusual." "Define unusual." Zara's voice was tight with exhaustion and fear. "Brain activity patterns that don't match infection, immunity, or normal fever response. It's like her neural pathways are rewiring themselves. I've never seen anything like it." The implications hung in the static-filled air like a death sentence. If Luna was changing in ways they didn't understand, if the virus was evolving beyond their comprehension, then everything they were fighting for might already be lost. Kestrel studied the zombie patrol patterns, her philosopher's mind automatically seeking underlying systems and meanings. "They're not just guarding," she realized. "They're learning. Watch the way they adjust their routes when they encounter obstacles, how they communicate with those subtle head movements. This isn't random behavior anymore." "Which makes them more dangerous but also more predictable," Thorne agreed. "Military tactics follow certain principles, even when the soldiers are dead." They waited for the next patrol rotation, then sprinted across the exposed parking lot with the desperate speed of people who knew they were running out of time in every possible sense. The hospital service entrance was unguarded for exactly 47 seconds, they counted, before the next zombie patrol would round the corner. Inside Mercy General, the darkness was absolute except for the faint glow of emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red shadows. The building smelled of death and disinfectant, a combination that had become as familiar as breathing. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of Kestrel's neck stand up, the sound of machinery still running somewhere deep in the building. "Someone's still here," Thorne whispered, following the sound of generators humming in the basement. "Or something." They found the engineering section 3 levels down, past corridors lined with abandoned gurneys and medical equipment that looked like medieval torture devices in the emergency lighting. The generator room door was reinforced with steel plates and deadbolts, and from within came the sound of not just machinery, but voices, human voices engaged in what sounded like technical discussion. Thorn knocked carefully, 3 short raps, pause, 2 short raps, pause, 3 short raps. It was an old construction site signal that meant, friendly worker seeking entry. The voices inside stopped immediately, followed by the sound of multiple locks being disengaged. The door opened to reveal a thin man in his 60s, his hospital ID badge identifying him as Chief Engineer Roosevelt Ashcroft. Behind him stood 2 other figures, a young woman in medical scrubs and an elderly man with the calloused hands of a career mechanic. Jesus Christ, Roosevelt breathed, lowering the shotgun he'd had trained on the door. Living people. We thought we were the last ones left in the city. How long have you been down here? Kestrel asked, noting the supplies stockpiled around the generator room, medical equipment, food, weapons, everything needed for an extended siege. 63 days, the woman in scrubs replied. She was Dr. Iris Goldwater, according to her badge, and her eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting an impossible battle for too long. We've been maintaining emergency power for the critical care units upstairs, but we're running out of everything: fuel, hope, reasons to keep going. The elderly mechanic, who introduced himself as Eugene Brightwater, gestured to the generators with professional pride. These beauties are identical to the ones at St. Mary's. We've been cannibalizing parts from the other units to keep the primary system running, but we're down to the last backup. We need parts, Thorne said urgently, explaining their situation at St. Mary's. Fuel pump assembly, pressure regulators, alternator if you have it. Roosevelt's face went pale. Taking those parts means shutting down our system. We've got 12 patients upstairs on life support, kids mostly, ones who haven't turned despite being bitten. We think some of them might be naturally immune, but they need constant medical care. It was the trolley problem made manifest in its cruelest form. Save the children at St. Mary's by dooming the children at Mercy General, or let both groups die to avoid making an impossible choice. The weight of 13 young lives hung in the recycled air like a physical presence. Show me the patients, Kestrel said quietly. Dr. Goldwater led them through corridors that had become a necropolis of modern medicine. The pediatric ICU was a heartbreaking tableau of small forms connected to machines that breathed and beeped and monitored the thin line between life and death. Most of the children bore bite marks that should have been death sentences, but here they were, unconscious but alive, their brain activity showing patterns that defied medical understanding. Similar to what you're seeing at St. Mary's, Dr. Goldwater explained. Elevated neural activity, immune system responses we can't categorize, blood chemistry that makes no sense. It's like they're becoming something new, but we don't know what. Through the radio, Orion's voice brought news from their own embattled hospital: zombies have reached the 2nd floor. We've barricaded the ICU, but they're using coordinated assault tactics. They'll break through within an hour. Eugene was already pulling parts from the secondary generators, his hands moving with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades making machines work when they should have failed. These'll fit your system, but installing them under combat conditions, that's another story entirely. We'll make it work, Thorne said, but his voice carried the weight of someone making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. As they prepared to leave with their salvaged parts, Dr. Goldwater made a request that cut to the heart of their shared nightmare: if you can save your children, and if they develop immunity, will you come back for ours? Kestrel looked around at the small faces connected to machines that would fail within hours of their departure, and made a promise that felt like signing her own death warrant: we'll come back. No matter what happens, we'll come back. They left Mercy General carrying the mechanical hearts of dying machines, pursued by the weight of promises that might be impossible to keep. Behind them, Dr. Goldwater began the process of switching her patients to manual ventilation, buying them hours instead of days, hope instead of certainty. The journey back through zombie-infested streets became a desperate race against time measured in heartbeats and breath cycles. Every second they spent dodging undead patrols was another second closer to multiple catastrophes, another moment where children died because adults couldn't solve problems fast enough. As they approached St. Mary's, they could see the building surrounded by hundreds of zombies that moved with military precision, and through their radio, they heard the sound that meant everything was about to end, the mechanical wheeze of generators beginning to fail. But they also heard something else, Ember's cough, weak but present, which meant he was still breathing on his own. Sometimes the smallest sounds carried the greatest hope. The final sprint to salvation began with the sound of dying machines and ended with the weight of impossible promises. But in between, there was the simple fact of not giving up, even when giving up would have been easier than breathing. Part 7, When Heroes Fall. The hospital's emergency generators gave their final mechanical death rattle just as Kestrel and Thorn reached the service entrance, plunging St. Mary's into a darkness that felt absolute and final. Through the building's broken windows, they could see the faint glow of battery-powered emergency lights, but even those were fading as backup systems failed one by one. Inside, the silence was worse than any sound, no mechanical breathing, no electronic heartbeats, no artificial symphony of life support. Just the terrifying quiet of machines that had stopped believing in miracles. Embers off the ventilator, Dr. Blackthorn's voice came through their radio, steady despite the catastrophe unfolding around her. I had to intubate manually and start hand ventilation. Zara's taking turns with me, but we can't maintain this indefinitely. Thorn was already sprinting toward the basement, his toolbox clanging against his back like mechanical prayer beads. Kestrel followed, her flashlight beam dancing across corridors that had become a maze of shadows and desperate hope. In the ICU, the scene was heartbreaking in its quiet desperation. Zara sat beside Ember's bed, manually squeezing an ambu bag in the rhythm that had kept her brother breathing for the past 20 minutes. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but her hands never faltered, each compression a small act of love against the dying of the light. Luna lay in the next bed, her fever having broken but her condition having evolved into something none of them understood. Her EEG readings, displayed on a battery-powered monitor, showed brain activity patterns that resembled no known medical condition. She was conscious but different, her eyes tracking movements with predatory intensity, her speech patterns changed in subtle ways that made Dr. Blackthorn deeply uneasy. The neural changes are accelerating, the doctor explained quietly. She's still Luna, still the same child cognitively, but there's something else there too. Enhanced pattern recognition, improved reflexes, sensory acuity that's beyond normal human parameters. Evolution, Kestrel whispered, understanding dawning like cold sunlight. The virus isn't just creating zombies, it's creating something new. The children who survive the infection aren't just immune, they're enhanced. From the basement came the sound of Thorn working frantically to install the salvaged parts, metal against metal in rhythms that sounded like mechanical prayer. But even if he succeeded, even if the generators came back online, they were surrounded by hundreds of zombies that had learned to think, to plan, to coordinate their attacks. Third floor has been breached, Orion reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. They're using the elevator shafts to bypass our barricades. I've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach the ICU level. Dr. Blackthorn was preparing emergency medical kits with the efficiency of someone who'd accepted that evacuation was their only option. I can intubate Ember with a portable ventilator, but moving him in his condition. She didn't finish the sentence because they all knew what it meant. Through the windows, they could see zombies scaling the hospital's exterior walls like grotesque mountaineers, using tools and teamwork that defied everything they thought they knew about the undead. These weren't mindless predators anymore, they were an organized force with tactical capabilities that might soon exceed human military efficiency. The lights suddenly blazed back to life as Thorn's repairs brought the generators online, and the familiar symphony of medical machinery resumed its electronic hymn. But the relief was short-lived. Now the zombies could see exactly where they were, and the building's lights made them a beacon in the darkness that called to every undead creature for miles around. We've got power, but not for long, Thorn's voice echoed through the building's PA system. The parts we installed are damaged, probably 15 minutes of operational time before total failure. 15 minutes to decide who lived and who died. 15 minutes to evacuate critical patients through a building swarming with zombies that had learned to hunt in packs. 15 minutes to make choices that would define the rest of their possibly very short lives. Luna sat up in her hospital bed, her enhanced senses apparently detecting something the rest of them had missed. "They're not trying to kill us," she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic that hadn't been there before her transformation. "They're trying to capture us. The smart ones want to study us, to understand how we're different." The implications hit them like ice water. If the evolved zombies were developing scientific curiosity, if they were trying to learn rather than simply consume, then the infection had progressed far beyond anything they'd imagined possible. "Marcus," Dr. Blackthorne called to the elderly diabetic who'd been helping maintain the equipment. "We need to evacuate now. Can you handle the portable insulin pump for the journey?" But Marcus didn't answer. He stood at the window, staring down at the zombie horde with an expression of strange recognition. "I know some of them," he said quietly. Dr. Patterson from oncology, Nurse Williams from pediatrics, the security guard who always smiled at everyone. "They're still in there, aren't they? Still people, just changed." Orion's voice cut through their philosophical crisis with military precision. "Zombies have reached this floor. We have maybe 3 minutes before they breach the ICU." The final countdown had begun, and they had to choose: try to save everyone and likely lose everyone, or make the brutal calculations that might save some while sacrificing others. It was the trolley problem written in blood and desperation, with no time for ethical deliberation. Zara continued manually ventilating Ember, her rhythm never faltering despite the chaos around her. Her dedication was absolute, her love uncompromising, and her determination to keep her brother breathing had become the moral center around which all their other choices revolved. Dr. Blackthorne began disconnecting Luna from her monitors, preparing the enhanced child for evacuation. But Luna resisted, her new capabilities apparently including enhanced empathy that let her sense the moral weight of their situation. "We can't leave the others," Luna said, referring to the patients at Mercy General who were depending on their promise to return. "If we run now, we become the same as the monsters outside." As the sound of breaking glass announced the zombies' final assault on their sanctuary, Kestrel realized that courage wasn't about making the right choice, it was about making a choice and accepting the consequences, even when all the options led to tragedy. The lights flickered once, a warning that their borrowed time was running out. In the darkness beyond their walls, the dead had learned to think. In the light of their machines, the living had to decide what it meant to remain human. Part 8, The Price of Tomorrow. The explosion that shattered the ICU's reinforced windows came from within the building, not without. Orion had detonated the improvised charges he'd placed in the elevator shafts, buying them perhaps 10 more minutes by collapsing the zombies' primary access route. But the sound also brought every undead creature in the city running toward their location, drawn by the promise of fresh prey trapped in a concrete box. Ember's eyes fluttered open as the shockwave rattled his hospital bed, and for a moment that felt like a small miracle, he tried to speak around the breathing tube. Zara immediately began checking his vitals while continuing the manual ventilation, tears streaming down her face as she realized her brother was conscious and aware for what might be the last time. Dr. Blackthorne worked with desperate efficiency to prepare the most critical patients for emergency evacuation. The service tunnels are our only way out, but they connect to the same network that the zombies have been using. We'll be running through their territory. Then we bring the fight to them, Luna said, her transformed physiology apparently including enhanced tactical thinking along with improved reflexes. The 8-year-old began sketching evacuation routes on a tablet with the precision of a military strategist, her enhanced pattern recognition revealing escape paths that the adults had missed. Through the radio, they could hear the desperate situation at Mercy General deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Goldwater's voice was strained with exhaustion as she reported manually ventilating 12 children with the help of Roosevelt and Eugene. Generator fuel is completely depleted. We're switching to battery backup, but that gives us maybe 2 hours before total life support failure. The weight of impossible promises pressed down on them like the hospital's concrete ceiling. They'd sworn to return for those children, but their own survival was becoming increasingly unlikely with each passing minute. The trolley problem had evolved into something worse, a scenario where trying to save anyone might doom everyone. Thorne emerged from the basement with grim news: the repairs are holding, but barely. We're drawing power from emergency reserves that were never meant to sustain full life support systems. The generators will fail completely within 30 minutes, and when they do, there won't be any way to restart them. 30 minutes to evacuate critical patients through zombie-infested tunnels to an uncertain destination. 30 minutes to honor promises made to dying children in another hospital. 30 minutes to decide whether survival meant preserving life or preserving humanity. Orion appeared in the ICU doorway, his tactical vest torn and bloodied from his running battle with the zombies who'd made it past his explosives. They're regrouping on every floor. The smart ones are directing the others, using hand signals and coordinated movements. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they organize a final assault. As if summoned by his words, the sound of systematic breaking glass echoed through the building. The zombies were destroying windows on multiple floors simultaneously, eliminating the survivors' options while preparing for a coordinated attack from several directions. "I have an idea," Luna said, her enhanced cognition apparently working through scenarios faster than adult minds could follow. "The zombies want to study us, to understand how we're different. What if we give them what they want?" Dr. Blackthorne looked horrified. "You're talking about surrender. About letting them capture you for experimentation." "I'm talking about sacrifice," Luna corrected, her child's voice carrying weight that belonged to someone much older. "If one of us stays behind to distract them, the others might escape. And if they're really trying to understand immunity and enhancement, maybe my cooperation could buy time for the children at Mercy General." The proposition hung in the air like surgical smoke, ethically complex and practically terrifying. Use a child as bait to save other children, sacrifice innocence to preserve innocence, trade one enhanced life for a dozen normal ones. "Absolutely not," Zara said fiercely, speaking for all of them. "We don't sacrifice children. Ever. That's where we draw the line between survival and becoming monsters ourselves." But Luna's enhanced empathy was already reading the room, sensing the desperate calculations each adult was making. "You're all thinking it," she said gently. "I can see it in your faces, hear it in your voices. Sometimes the math is simple, even when it's terrible." The lights flickered again, longer this time, and the sound of mechanical breathing became irregular as the ventilators struggled with fluctuating power. Ember's condition was stabilizing, but he still needed medical support that required electricity, expertise, and time they didn't have. Marcus, the elderly diabetic, made the choice for them with quiet dignity. "I'll stay," he said, checking his blood glucose monitor one final time. "My insulin ran out this morning. Without refrigerated supplies, I've got maybe 6 hours before diabetic coma. But 6 hours is long enough to keep some machines running, long enough to be interesting to zombies who want to study human physiology." "Marcus, no," Dr. Blackthorne started, but he was already moving toward the door with the determined pace of someone who'd accepted his fate. "This is what courage looks like," he said, echoing words Kestrel had spoken in her philosophy classes a lifetime ago. "Not the absence of fear, but choosing to act despite being terrified, choosing meaning over survival when the two become incompatible." Through the building's PA system, his voice reached every floor as he began speaking to the zombies in calm, measured tones, offering himself as a willing subject for their study in exchange for time for the others to escape. The response was immediate. The systematic destruction stopped, replaced by organized movement toward the ICU level. "Move now," Orion commanded, and they began the desperate evacuation that Marcus had bought with his life. Zara carried Ember in her arms while manually maintaining his airway. Dr. Blackthorne supported Luna despite the child's enhanced capabilities, and Thorne and Kestrel managed the portable medical equipment that meant the difference between life and death. As they entered the service tunnels, they could hear Marcus continuing his calm dialogue with creatures that had once been human, buying them precious minutes with stories about medical procedures, pharmaceutical protocols, anything that might satisfy the zombies' newfound scientific curiosity. The journey through the tunnels became a race against multiple countdowns, Ember's need for sustained medical care, Luna's mysterious transformation that was still progressing, the failing life support systems at Mercy General, and their own exhaustion that was beginning to compromise decision-making. But they also carried something more valuable than medical equipment or tactical advantage, the knowledge that humanity's survival wasn't just about preserving biological life, but about maintaining the values that made life worth preserving. Hours later, in a makeshift medical facility established in an abandoned subway station, they received Marcus's final transmission, weak but triumphant. He'd convinced the zombies to redirect their attention to Mercy General, where his promise of 12 immunized children had bought Dr. Goldwater's group enough time to evacuate to their own secure location. Ember breathed on his own for the first time in days, his recovery accelerated by Luna's enhanced blood which carried antibodies they were only beginning to understand. The children from both hospitals survived, though forever changed by experiences that redefined childhood innocence. As Kestrel watched Luna teaching other survivors how to recognize zombie communication patterns, she realized that the apocalypse hadn't just ended one world, it had begun another. The children who survived the plague carried within them the seeds of humanity's next evolutionary step, enhanced but still recognizably human, stronger but not hardened against love and sacrifice. In the distance, the city belonged to the dead who'd learned to think. But in their underground sanctuary, the living had learned that thinking wasn't enough, you also had to choose what to think about, what to value, what to preserve when preservation required sacrifice. Marcus's voice echoed in their makeshift medical bay through recordings they'd saved. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something else is more important than fear. In the new world they were building, one breath and one heartbeat at a time, they carried forward not just the biology of survival, but the soul of what it meant to remain human when humanity itself was evolving. The war between the living and the dead continued, but it had become something more complex than simple survival. It had become a question of what kind of future was worth fighting for, and what price they were willing to pay to ensure that future included room for both courage and compassion. Outside their sanctuary, the zombies continued their inexorable evolution. Inside, the survivors tended to enhance children who might hold the key to humanity's next chapter, or its final page. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.